Shalom from Jerusalem. This is Chuck Cohen giving a video update of Intercessors for Israel's International Prayer Conference 2016. Gosh, the year has fled. We're already in this new year. We've had some exciting things this past year, including the graduation of our precious brother Lance Lambert, who is now in glory. But we're pressing on, and so we want to give you an update. Now, understand that we're doing it this year via Skype. We're hoping the quality is as good as previous years, but there are certain circumstances that permit us to only do it this year via Skype, at least for the first number of days. And so it's good to have you with us. If you see I'm wearing this, it's because it's cold in Zion. So here we go. We're going to start off. Last night, our opening meeting. I think most of you who've been following this know that the theme for the conference is truth falling in the streets from Isaiah 59. And last night at our opening session, the chairman of Intercessors for Israel, Eliyahu Ben Chaim, actually preached from Isaiah 59, verse 14 to 21, giving all the examples of how truth has so quickly in the past year fallen into the streets. Whether it is the P5+1 deal with Iran, which is a total wicked deal based on trusting a lion regime that continues to challenge both America and Israel, that cries out death to Israel, death to America. Still, let's go ahead and give them $100 billion+ because they signed a deal. Or whether it is the Supreme Court in America approving gay marriage, and so many other places in which morality has just taken a swan dive compared to what the Bible really says. Not just approving gay marriage, but making it a constitutional right. And then there is so much else. The UN constantly blaming Israel for being the one who is at the fault for not having a peace deal, and President Obama and John Kerry, the Secretary of State of the United States, constantly blaming Israel, never mentioning the incitement from the Palestinians, the incitement from Mahmoud Abbas, the knife intifada, and then everybody were being terrorized here in the streets in Israel. Not nearly as bad as it was in Paris or San Bernardino, but terrorized in the streets continually since Rosh Hashanah, the new year last September. And yet, what does the world say to us? Israel, you've got to stop using such violence to stop these young kids. When a child is running at you with a knife, a teenager, what are we supposed to do? Say, oh, please put the knife down? That doesn't work. And so obviously our security forces, to protect the innocent, are going to end up having to use deadly force. Anyway, Eliyahu ran through this whole list of doing this. Some of the scriptures he used were from 2 Timothy, where in chapter 3, Paul says, the last days will be ferocious times or perilous times. And then he goes through a whole list. If you read 2 Timothy 3, 1-5, 8, 9, and 13, you'll see it just lines up perfectly with what's going on today. Then Eliyahu also applied in a spiritual manner Isaiah 28, 14-15, the covenant with death and the agreement with Sheol, or the grave. Eliyahu was very clear that this definitely applied literally to the scornful men who ruled Israel back in Isaiah's day, but there's a spiritual principle. And now the leadership of the Palestinians are very scornful about their leadership role in Israel, saying the Al-Aqsa Mosque is ours, and Mahmoud Abbas said the dirty feet of the Jews will not contaminate the Temple Mount. It's like the Temple Mount never existed in Solomon's day. There was no temple of the Lord in Solomon's day or in David's and Hezekiah's day. It was all Muslim. And they are very scornful. And of course, you can see this in the spirit of Islam, and especially amongst the Palestinians. They have made a covenant with death, an agreement with the grave. And we see this by them threatening Israel in the West by saying things like this: because we love death and you love life, we're going to defeat you. Well, they love death. That's a covenant with death, an agreement with Sheol. And so he applied this to both the Palestinians and the radical Islam. And then he went on to talk about, though, in the midst of this, how Israel is rated number 11 on the world's happiness index, number 6 on the world's health rating, number 18 on the UN Human Development Index, and number 5 on the Bloomberg Innovation Index. So in other words, despite all the pressure and the terror that we have to face, Israel as a nation is doing real well. Not only are the deserts blossoming as a rose, literally, but this nation is also blossoming into its own figuratively and spiritually. And this is what we would expect, because God says very clearly in Ezekiel 36 that he's doing this not for our sake, but for his holy name's sake. And then Eliyahu finished with talking about Isaiah 59, verse 18 to 19. When the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against it. And he brought out, there are some people who look at the Hebrew and say it can actually be read this way. When the enemy comes in, like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord lifts up a standard against it. Now, I know that's mixing metaphors, but that's the way the Hebrew can be read. And we often see the Lord coming in like a flood to save his people. And so that's where we ended last night. And then obviously this morning, as we met, we wanted to pray into some of these things. And before we did that, our brother Jeremy Smith, who, by the way, has just been released miraculously from a hospital to be with us. I forgot to mention one thing. We had a very interesting start to the prayer conference yesterday when our brother Mark Chapinski, who leads us in worship, was sitting on the chair ready, and he just crashed over. And apparently his heart was in they call it arrhythmatic. I don't know what it was. They took him to the hospital. He's getting a pacemaker put in today, and the doctor said you can probably come back to the conference fairly soon. It's amazing what happened. We ended up worshiping the Lord anyway, but it sure got our attention to the seriousness of the hour. Same thing with Jeremy Smith, coming from a very severe infection back to the conference to be with us. And Jeremy is giving a morning devotional on what is faith. And he talked about Moses in Hebrews 11 choosing to stand with the people of God as opposed to the riches of Pharaoh, the riches of Egypt. And then he said to all of us at the conference that we are people of faith because we're choosing to stand with the people of God, this nation. We may not feel like we have faith, we may be weak in it, but God sees us as having faith because we're standing with this nation as opposed to the riches of the world and the riches of the spiritual Egypt, the spiritual Babylon. Anyway, the first session, Eliyahu again got up and gave us an update on the Middle East, going all around all the areas, everywhere from Pakistan to Turkey, all the way down to Egypt and Iran, and just giving us an update. And we realized that the Middle East is in total chaos. One group is fighting another, one group is hating another, whether it's Shiite and Sunni, or the Turks versus the Persians, the Iranians, and yet Israel, in the midst of this, is an oasis of peace. And so in the second session, we ran through our prayer guidelines, which you can find on our website. We're not going to go through that. And then we prayed for the leadership in Israel to know how to respond to this chaotic situation in the Middle East. And some of the verses that were used were Jeremiah 3:15, that God promises when he brings us back from the north, he will give us shepherds, pastors, after his own heart. We prayed for Netanyahu, Psalm 80, verse 17, strengthen the man, the son of man who you've made strong for yourself, lift him up in Psalm 180, verse 17. We asked for much wisdom for the leaders of Israel. We asked for faith for us to be able to see what God was doing as he's watching over Israel. There were a number of verses that a number of people were given in prayer that we encourage them, even though somebody else has used that verse, use it again because the Lord may be speaking to us, such as Proverbs 21:1. The heart of the king is in the hands of the Lord. He turns it whatever way he wants. Proverbs 11:14, in a multitude of counselors, there is safety. 1 Chronicles 12:32, make the leaders of Israel like the sons of Issachar, who who knew what Israel what to do and knew the signs of the times. And then somebody prayed that Yeshua would place his pacemaker in the hearts of Israelis' leaders. And since we all were talking about Mark and his pacemaker, that really struck us as maybe that's one of the things God was trying to say to us. And we really took that on board, that Yeshua would be the one to regulate how the heart beats in Israel's leadership. Then we also prayed specifically more against the threat from Hezbollah in the north. And we prayed for God to confound his enemies like he has always seemed to do. We prayed that no weapon formed against us would prosper, and that based on that Israel would be able to redeploy or to deploy all of its anti-missile technology facing the 100,000 to 150,000 missiles that Hezbollah has facing on us. A number of people prayed out of Psalm 83, and we also then proclaimed Psalm 55, verse 9. Confound those who, no, that's not Psalm 55, verse 9. Destroy, Lord, and divide their tongues, specifically over Hezbollah's leadership. And then we went on to pray concerning the Iranian threat, and a number of people prayed out of Jeremiah 49. If you've been following our prayer alerts on Friday, you probably know that fairly well, that God would destroy the king and the princes and set up his throne in Elam. And then we finally, now remember, we're taking 4 hours of intensive prayer each morning, so I'm just summarizing this. But we ended by recognizing that in Iran right now, God is setting up his throne in Elam, in Iran, by causing the church in Iran to be one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing churches in the world. And so we ended up our time praying specifically that God would make these precious Persian believers intercessors for Israel. And that's how we ended our time this morning. May the Lord bless you, and Lord willing, we'll see you tomorrow. Stay warm wherever you are. Lehitraot, shalom from Jerusalem.